What do both of you anticipate coming out of the summit? Is it a nothing burger? Is it a something burger? Is it a poutine taco? Like, what's happening?
Poutine taco. Now, there's another image.
Welcome to Canusa Street, a podcast at the intersection of the issues and policies between Canada and the United States. Here are your hosts, Scotty Greenwood and Chris Sands.
Welcome back to Canusa Street, everybody. My name is Chris Sands, and I'm from the Wilson Center's Canada Institute, and I'm here with the woman who makes things happen in Washington, Ottawa, and everywhere else, my good friend, Scotty Greenwood. Hi, Scotty.
Hey, Chris. It's good to be with you. And this is kind of a fun switcheroo for our normal introductions. You doing the lead-in, me coming in second.
Well, so, it's a very special episode because we are not just interviewing a guest. We are interviewing one of my colleagues at the Wilson Center, Andrew Rudman. And I'll let you do the formal introduction. That's the purpose of the switcheroo. But Andrew runs the Mexico Institute, counterpart to the Canada Institute, here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. He's a good sport to come on the program. And I'll leave it to you, Scotty, to give him a formal introduction.
Sounds good. And what I love about you, Chris, is you do everything I do, but you do it backwards and in high heels. As Ginger Rogers once said about Fred Astaire, or vice versa, whatever. Andrew, thank you for coming. I will introduce you properly as Chris normally would do. He mentioned that you're his counterpart. I would say NAFTA, or North America, better said, North America is well represented because we're three Americans and we talk about Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. So here we go. Before coming over here to the Wilson Center, though, Andrew was the managing director at Monarch Global Strategies, which is a boutique strategic advisory firm located in Washington, D.C. I can relate to that. Boutique strategic advisory firms. You focused on government relations and market access for companies that were interested in doing business in Mexico and other Latin American countries. I'd love to know where you got your interest in the hemisphere. We can talk about that. Andrew managed Monarch's health care practice and supported clients across a range of sectors and interests. And we know that you also write extensively, and you're renowned for speaking on Mexican healthcare and other policy issues. And importantly, Chris, and the reason we're all here, the reason we're talking about with Andrew, is the three of us are headed to Mexico City shortly. So Andrew, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Scotty, and thank you, Chris. Really great to be here with both of you. Looking forward to the conversation, and as you said, really looking forward to seeing you next week in Mexico.
Yeah, I think the cuisine might be a little bit different in when we all get to Mexico City. At least I hope it will. Nothing wrong with the cuisine here in the food court at the Reagan Building in Washington, D.C. I do love a good Panera bread, avocado melt, but I think we'll be enjoying some things. So
there's one thing you didn't mention in his intro, and I know he sometimes mentions it for our Canadian audiences, but Andrew has a Canadian connection.
Oh, let's hear it.
I do. My mom was a proud Newfie. And,
okay.
Yes. So I always say, when I was asked recently, I think Chris was there, when someone asked about my interest in Mexico. I said, well, I've been interested in Mexico for a long time, but I've been interested in Canada for even longer.
Even longer, since before you were born.
Exactly.
Yeah, that was good planning. So how did you get your interest in Mexico? Let's start with that.
I actually got interested in Mexico. I spent my first semester of college, my first semester freshman year in a language program in Cuernavaca, which is outside of Mexico City.
And where were you in college?
I went to Colby College in Waterville,
Maine.
Yes.
My mom went to Colby College in Waterville,
really?
Maine. Gosh.
Wow.
I thought you were going to say Middlebury, because a lot of people that are proficient in languages have gone to Middlebury. Anybody who goes to school in Vermont or Maine, I give extra credit to. So that's pretty neat.
Well, I grew up in Maine, so it wasn't that much of a stretch.
All right. Well, let's talk, Chris, for a moment about why we're all going to Mexico City. Do you want to talk about the North Capital Forum a little bit?
Well, and Andrew can talk about it as well. But there is a conference put together by the U.S. Mexico Foundation called the North Capital Forum. It's bringing together Americans, Canadians to talk about the future of North America, and it will be well represented. It's a business audience with some participation from government. A really interesting time for everyone to be getting together, looking at where Mexico is going. We have the new USMCA, so many different changes in the relationship, and we're meeting in Mexico City just a little bit ahead of the next North American Leaders Summit, we think, the NALS, which is also coming up hopefully later this year. But that you know more about that, Andrew, than I do.
Expertise on both of those things, Andrew. What are you looking forward to from the North Capitol Forum, and then let's also talk about the Leaders Summit, if you could.
You know, I in terms of the North Capitol Forum, I think the fact that my understanding is it's actually oversubscribed, and I think that just shows the level of interest among Canadians, Americans, and Mexicans in North America and in finding ways to collaborate. You know, I think the move, as you both know well, toward nearshoring or ally shoring or friend shoring, whatever phrase anybody wants to use, is certainly alive and well. It's a big focus of the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship.
Well, yeah, so there was a high-level delegation of American officials in Mexico City quite recently, a few days ago. Is Mexico poised to take advantage of this decoupling with China, decoupling with Russia, nearshoring? Is there a lot of activity there? Or our listeners are largely Americans and Canadians, and perhaps if they're interested in Canusa Street, they haven't focused a lot south of the southern border. So maybe bring us up to speed about what's happening in Mexico these days, and generally, but particularly with nearshoring. Are they going to be able to seize the moment, or are they seizing the moment?
Scotty, that's a really good question. I think, are they going to seize the moment? It certainly depends on who you ask, but Mexico should be poised. It has a number of advantages. Obviously, many of those are exactly the same as the advantages that Canada has: the proximity, the long-standing ties, the integration, particularly of the auto industry and the agricultural sector. And the Secretariat of Economy is certainly committed to working with the U.S. to promote opportunities for more nearshoring. That being said, President López Obrador has an energy policy which is very much focused on augmenting the market power of Pemex, the state oil company, and CFE, the electricity company,
at the expense of other private investors, right?
Exactly, yes. And there are some real concerns. And when people talk about investing in Mexico, there are, as I said, huge advantages. The opportunities in renewable energy are incredible. Sonora in the north of Mexico is one of the sunniest places in the world. The potential for renewable energy is great in solar, in wind, in hydro, and there are some real concerns that this policy that has favored the state and favored fossil fuels is maybe a deterrent to investment. So I think the answer is, are they poised, or is there an opportunity? Yes. Is Mexico poised to take it? In some ways, yes, but probably not as much as it should be.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things I always like when I go to Mexico is doing comparisons in my head, Canada versus Mexico. We recently had an episode where we talked a little bit about the parliamentary system versus the presidential system. How does Mexico, and this is a lot to ask in a simple question, but how does Mexico run? Federal versus the states.
Does it run on Dunkin' Donuts, Tim Hortons, or
exactly? What makes it tick? And where's the power? Where are the deciders in a system like Mexico's?
Mexico has a federal system that is certainly more similar to the U.S. than the Canadian system. There is a president. There is a Congress. The Mexican president has much more power than the U.S. president, particularly right now where the president has a majority in both houses. He does not have a qualified majority. That is, he doesn't have 2/3 to change the Constitution. But
he's he only gets one term, right?
It's a one-term presidency, right? It's a 6-year term.
Like being governor of Virginia.
Yeah, like being governor.
Except they only
get only longer.
Only longer, and I think López Obrador, or AMLO, has more power than Governor Youngkin, but in terms of length and
bigger
one term,
jurisdiction too, though.
Yes, that is also true. and I think Youngkin could technically run for election again someday, and I don't
yes.
think so. But I think we're off topic.
What happens? What do Mexican presidents do, Andrew, after their term? What's the recent history of that?
Some of them have President Calderon, who was right before AMLO, if I'm not mistaken, is teaching at Yale. Some have done some sort of consulting. Some have obviously been older and done, I think, similar things to what U.S. presidents do when they retire.
Enrique Peña Nieto was in there, and I know that he was criticized for scandals. There were a few things where people thought he was getting, or his wife was getting a house or so on. Is there that sense that they're one step away from their opponents prosecuting them? We're talking about political polarization. Is it something similar in Mexico?
There is definitely more polarization. There was a referendum that López Obrador really likes referenda, whether they're sort of fully organized and or not. He likes to have a referenda, and there was one that the question that was asked, I'm obviously paraphrasing, was more along the lines of, should the government consider prosecuting past presidents who may have committed crimes? And that passed, as you would expect, something written that way would pass. There haven't been any prosecutions of any of those presidents. But again, I think that speaks to the polarization, in the sense López Obrador is very critical of all his predecessors, and particularly those he calls neoliberals, those who sort of adopted what we might think of as called the Washington Consensus, or that trying to favor or at least promote private investment, which is not something that AMLO has been a big fan of.
Yeah, it's always interesting to me as somebody from the business community when governments are not looking for private investment or dollars flowing in. Let me ask you a very basic question, since we're about to travel and I've got you on the air, and maybe they'll edit this out. I don't know. We'll see.
Depends on what I say.
Well, yeah. So as we were recording this, it's reported that Canada is going to eliminate what's known as the ArriveCan app, which is an app that you download on your phone if you want to enter Canada, and you have to give a whole bunch of information about your vaccine status and where you would stay if you were to contract COVID, et cetera, et cetera. It was a good idea at the beginning of the pandemic, actually, as they were controlling the flow of people. It became less use. It outlived its usefulness, in my opinion. But anyway, it's about to go away. So as we head to Mexico, is there anything is there an Arrive Mexico app, or what do we need to know as Americans traveling to Mexico? Or have you been lately?
I was last there in April.
Okay.
I don't think there's an app. Mexico does have something similar to Global Entry.
Okay.
But it's not interchangeable with U.S. Global. So if you have Global Entry here, it does not work in Mexico. They did have something similar, or do have something similar. Mexico really did not restrict, in fact, didn't restrict travel during COVID at all.
Interesting. Okay.
And we could talk at great length about how Mexico responded to COVID, but
how were the health outcomes? Because Canada, relative COVID is tragic, and but Canada's health outcome, Canada was very strict, and its health outcomes per capita were better than the U.S., fewer deaths. So how about Mexico?
Now, Mexico, unfortunately, had one of the highest excess death rates in the world.
Oh, okay.
Some of that was due to a healthcare system that, prior to AMLO coming into office, Mexico for years had been underspending in healthcare. So you had a system that really wasn't prepared to respond to a global pandemic. And then for reasons including the economics of the López Obrador administration also spent less on stimulus than almost any country in the world, out of two things. One, an aversion to accumulating debt. And also because so much of the economy is informal and people need to be out, in the streets if they're vendors or things like that. So there was a lot more opportunity, let's say, to, or people weren't isolating at home as much. Some out of economic necessity. Some because the López Obrador administration didn't take it as seriously. There were lots of ways you can compare AMLO and Trump. And one was that AMLO said things like that, Mexicans need to hug, so this social distancing thing is unnecessary.
Wow.
At one point, he famously in a press conference took out sort of a mass card or an icon. I don't remember exactly what it was, and basically said that, God would protect him from COVID. So he was still traveling and wading into crowds. And so it really, there were a lot of mixed messages.
Ultimately, or do we know?
As far as we know, he didn't.
Interesting. So God protected him, maybe.
Maybe so. Maybe so.
maybe she took pity on the guy. So I can't resist having you two experts here, Chris for Canada and you for Mexico. We talk a lot in the United States about the U.S.-Mexico relationship. I think people have a sense of what it's about from their own perspective. It's a lot about immigration. And it's a lot about economics and all of that. But you don't hear as much about the Canada-Mexico relationship. So maybe since you two are here, Chris, I'd ask you both the same question. Like, from Andrew, first with you, from your perspective as a Mexico expert, how is Mexico's relationship with Canada, but then also with the world? How, and then Chris, I'll ask you about how Canadians view the Mexico relationship, because they've got us sitting in the middle, right? And it's maybe a little awkward. I don't know. Andrew?
Yeah, I think Chris and I talk about this all the time. In so many ways, the North American relationship is well, I say two bilateral relationships, or technically three, but the third, that Mexico-Canada leg, is without a doubt the shortest leg, or the smallest leg. Obviously, some of it is because of the U.S. being in the middle. I think some of it is that in any threesome, there's always somebody who feels like they're being left out. And so I think sometimes both Canadians and Mexicans, I remember this when I was in the NAFTA office of commerce, where, sometimes both Canada or Mexico want a bilat. They want the one-on-one. They don't necessarily want the third. Sometimes I remember, at NAFTA Free Trade Commission meetings, you've both seen this, where you wound up with a dynamic where the U.S. and Canada were sort of beating up on Mexico, and they didn't want to do that, but they both had the same complaints. The current USMCA dispute on energy is a good example.
Good example of that. Same idea.
I think you have to do what you have to do, but there's always been, I think, that reluctance of the two more developed partners to beat up on the third.
They just take turns. They don't have
and on occasion, there are certainly examples under the Trump administration where Mexico and Canada were on the same side. If you think about the threat of NAFTA withdrawal, I mean, my perception was you had Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. business community all on one side, and the Trump administration on another side.
Or steel and aluminum tariffs that were misguided.
Exactly. Same case where both countries, I think Canada more... I don't know if strident is the fair word, but the idea that Canada was perceived as somehow a security threat, I think bothered Canadians more than it bothered Mexicans. But it wasn't the Mexicans thought it was okay. It's just, the relationship is different.
Yeah, and the sensitivity is like water off a duck's back. Well, why don't we take a little break here, and then when we come back, Chris, maybe you can answer the same question about how Canada and Mexico get together.
Absolutely.
The Wilson Center Canada Institute is a proud co-producer of the Canusa Street podcast. For more insights and analysis from the world's leading think tank on Canada-U.S. relations, visit our site at www.wilsoncenter.org. That's www.wilsoncenter.org.
So we're back, and we're talking for a moment about the Canada-Mexico relationship, which is, I think, underexplored, and it's kind of great to be a fly on the wall in the Wilson Center with these brilliant people. So you guys talk about it talk among yourselves, but bring our listeners in, Chris. How do you think about the Canada-Mexico relationship, or do you think about it?
I actually do. When I first was in Washington, I was in grad school, and I got my first think tank job at CSIS.
Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Sorry, I should rely on the acronym. Yes, Center for Strategic and International Studies.
We get paid by the acronym in Washington, so it's no problem.
That's exactly right.
Thank you for the mentioning. They will appreciate it also. They had set up a Canada project because they had a Mexico project, which was big and robust. Americans pay attention to, that sense that there's a country that's interesting where everything may not be going well. So they had a great practice. But NAFTA coming on the horizon, people saw it, made CSIS think, my bosses, well, we should do Canada as well. So I do think a lot about Mexico because well, really, without Mexico, I'm not sure my career would have taken off. So I don't want to blame that on Mexico necessarily. but it
Mine
really,
too, in a sense.
and if you compare those days when we were first sort of putting Canada and Mexico together, back then, some Canadians traveled to Mexico for, vacation, etc., but the relationship was minimal. Very few Spanish speakers in Canada. They weren't getting, television or ads or pop culture carrying over. I hesitate to say back then there wasn't really the internet as we know it today, and so our younger listeners will definitely put me out with the dinosaurs. But there was relatively little contact, and that lack of contact meant that what Canadians and Mexicans knew about each other was at best kind of rumors or a few photos from National Geographic's, things, but nothing very deep. And as time went on, you saw Canadians deepening their knowledge slowly, and it was often the private sector. There's a period of time when Canadian oil field services companies and engineering companies saw Mexico growing, and they wanted to be part, particularly after the energy reforms that AMLO is now taking part. They wanted to get part as investors. They wanted to take part in that. One of the things we share very much is the auto industry, and Canadians didn't think of themselves as exporting to Mexico so much as exporting to GM and Ford or Toyota in the United States, which was then exporting it on to Mexico. So they had a sense they were in that space, but it was all very mediated, and I think that's the sort of official relationship. And then a couple other things. Shortly after NAFTA, Canada took its seat at the Organization of American States, which is our regional assembly, kind of precursor to the United Nations, and so Canadians were there and joining the debates about hemispheric affairs in a way that they hadn't before. That was another one of Brian Mulroney's initiatives, and you could see the relationship was beginning to grow, but a couple of things got in the way. And I always remember Robert Pastor, who taught at American University, used to get so frustrated with the Canadians. I know, the late great, but he would be frustrated because the Canadians reacted to episodes that got blown out of proportion because there was so little baseline knowledge. And there was a case in which a woman named Brenda Martin had been arrested. She was the cook and cleaning lady for a Canadian who was involved with a drug cartel. And I think the Mexican police were hoping that she would give up the secrets, etc. And she somehow got a news reporter with a camera in to see her in jail, and she said that I'm being poorly treated. This is a third world country. This is really terrible. And see, for a lot of Canadians, it was a bit of a shock. Later, when Stephen Harper was Prime Minister, you'll remember this, there was a bit of a surge of those coyotes, the human traffickers who were moving people, began moving them in through Canada. They would just take them from Mexico to Canada, then have them cross the northern border because they knew it wasn't nearly as toughly guarded. And, of course, we had to
begs the question of why would you leave Canada if you make it that far? But anyway, yes. The purpose was to bring them down here, but
purpose was to
nevertheless they did.
It's cold in Canada.
But
that's true. If you don't have the right clothing, it's a disaster.
But I remember that episode too because the Mexicans reached out and said, we don't like human trafficking either. Let's work together and prosecute this thing. But Stephen Harper decided we're going to put a visa requirement on all Mexicans coming to Canada.
Yeah, there's quite a chill in the relationship.
So I think the Canadians are growing. They're growing in their knowledge and their interaction with Mexicans, all to the good. But there have been some bumps recently and some episodes that I think, if the relationship was richer, like the Canada-U.S. relationship with so much going on, you could have a really annoying episode, and it's just that. Here, I think those things have tended to get blown out of proportion and make people say, wait a minute, it's too risky, I'm not going to get closer.
Interesting.
Yeah. Now that's a good point. I mean, one of the hallmarks of the U.S.-Mexico relationship has been an ability, interrupted a little bit of late, but traditionally not to cross lines. So, you dealt with migration was migration, trade was trade, security was security, and you didn't sort of cross-pollinate. And so to your point, when you can say, nope, we're going to deal with that between the trade ministers or between the security ministers, and it doesn't become, it doesn't start crossing. Now, under the Trump administration, that changed because President Trump connected migration and trade by threatening by threatening tariffs if Mexico didn't cooperate on migration.
Right. Frank McKenna, who is a former Canadian ambassador to the United States, had an analogy that I'm going to use, but make it North American instead, make it trilateral instead of bilateral. So the relationship, it's like before NAFTA, before we integrated economically, it's like we were three people in our own individual canoes. And now we're in the same canoe, but America is like the really fat kid in the middle. And if the fat kid stands up, it kind of rocks the boat. Anyway.
That's an image we'll carry with us for a while.
There you go. Thank you, Frank McKenna, for that. Andrew, what's the biggest opportunity, do you think, for Mexico and for North America right now?
I think it goes back to the question you asked before. It really is the move back to nearshoring or ally shoring of supply chains getting shorter and wanting to build in redundancy and learning from the economic impact and experience of the pandemic. And despite what I said about the energy policy in Mexico being questionable, over the long haul, I think Mexico is so integrated into the U.S. that, I think over time, that is going to be where the opportunities are. And I think the energy issues will get sorted out. I don't know exactly how. It may take until the next president is elected in Mexico in 2024. But I think, that is the opportunity, much as Mexico, similar to Canada, has always talked about trying to diversify its trade and not be so dependent. But, the geography and the integration is such that you're kind of, you are where you are. It's what you just said. We're in the same canoe and we're really not going anywhere.
Well, and is Mexico willing to kind of decouple with China in the way that the U.S. seems to want to do? Is that a thing south of the border?
I mean, the Mexico-China relationship, I think, is different than the Chinese relationship with other countries in that Mexico is a more industrialized economy. So it's not like South America where it's export of commodities. China and Mexico are competitors in ways because of labor and production. So they're competitors in ways that maybe China and Brazil or China and Argentina aren't. One of the issues that I think is sort of undefined that people have said to me many times is it isn't clear, or this person, a former Mexican official that I'm thinking of, said it was never clear where the red line was of exactly how much can Mexico do with China before the U.S. steps in. But one example was when the U.S. was discouraging Chinese 5G, and the Mexican officials were saying, okay, well, what should we do instead? And the U.S. wasn't really offering a good alternative. Like,
so what happened with that?
Nothing.
Did Mexico go with Huawei, or did they go a different way?
Well, they had Huawei for some of the lower systems, I think 4G, 3G, yes? 2G?
I believe so.
Because I do think there's some equipment. Yeah, we'll find out.
I'm not 100% certain. I know that there was that at times, the U.S. officials have suggested, Nokia and Ericsson and other technologies that aren't U.S. but also aren't China, right? Which is that weird policy of the U.S. of advocating for one foreign country against a different foreign manufacturer.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if it's weird or if it's self-interested, but call it what you will. Well, let me this is a switcheroo episode, Chris. So let me ask one more question, and of both of you, and then you can ask some more of your colleague if you want.
Sure.
So the other thing that's coming up with Mexico, the United States, and Canada, as we mentioned at the top, is the North American Leaders Summit. We think it's going to be in December. I don't think a date has been set. We think Mexico is the host, right? Because it's their turn.
It's their turn.
What do both of you anticipate coming out of the summit? Is it a nothing burger? Is it a something burger? Is it a poutine taco? Like, what's happening?
Poutine taco. Now, there's another image we'll take with us from this episode.
Yeah, that's what the fat kid in the middle of the canoe thinks. He eats a lot of.
Oh, gosh. I'll just say that at the outset, I think Canadians are going to be watching this. We stopped having the so-called Three Amigos summits under Donald Trump, and Canada was probably
we didn't have any.
We didn't have any
4 years. So it's been 6 years.
Yeah, and we had one last December that the U.S. hosted, and it was the first time. It was sort of returned to normal with the Biden administration. But even before that, I think the U.S. had much more enthusiasm for these summits than the Canadians did. I think twice when it was Canada's turn to host, Canada chose not to. Once was when it was hosting G7 and G20, I think, in 2007. And then there was another another one where they just, I think 2011, where they let their turn pass. But this was because there were other things or it couldn't be squeezed into the schedule. But the U.S. Has probably been the most dedicated to the trilateral. And
You think?
I think so. I think the U.S. has wanted to have the trilateral meetings in a lot of ways, and Mexico hosting this year is going to be followed by Canada hosting next year. So I think a lot of Canadians are looking to this meeting to say, okay, well, we know the Americans started this process back up again. Where is Mexico going to go, and what are we going to get as a handoff?
Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I think maybe Canada's lack of enthusiasm gets back to what I was saying before, of preferring the bilateral to the trilateral.
Yeah.
So maybe the U.S. sees it, I mean, as, okay, we can meet with both at the same time, and
there's an efficiency argument that you
right. Whereas for Canada or for Mexico, I think it's a fear that the U.S. that the U.S. will pay attention to the other guy and not to us,
right?
And that we have our own issues, which you do, but in any of the trilaterals I've ever been involved in, there's always bilats as well, right? There's a time when the U.S. and Canada go off and talk about their problems, and there's a time when U.S. and Mexico talk about their problems. So you can still do that. I'm a big fan of. I think the fact that they meet is important. I think we have to be realistic that the deliverables tend to be lots of aspirational statements and promises, and then the question is what comes out of it, and that's the same with the U.S.-Mexico high-level economic dialogue. They have talked about a lot of things they want to do. There is some positive movement, but at the end of the day, it's easy to say, hey, we ought to do X thing. It's harder to bring it down to land that big promise. So my guess is there would be lots of promises to continue to cooperate on nearshoring and pandemic recovery, and there'll be some efforts to finesse talking about renewables and climate change in ways that won't force the Mexicans to say something they don't want to say, but will allow the Biden and Trudeau administrations to say what they want to say.
What are you referring to there? What do the Mexicans not want to say on renewables?
Because López Obrador is such an advocate of fossil fuels.
Yeah, okay.
He's been, and because it's almost
to net zero by.
No. Mexico had made commitments, but that's not his focus. I mean, he really, and what I think he would say where he's sitting here is he's not opposed. He would argue it's not that he's opposed to renewables, it's that he is so in favor of the continued growth and development and primacy of Pemex, which is the state oil company, and of the state electricity company, which relies on fossil fuels for a lot of its generation. So it's more of renewables as sort of a threat to the primacy of
see. And
Pemex.
Just speaking of that, what's the situation? Does Mexico export liquefied natural gas, or could it? Like, does the situation in Europe with Russia provide an opportunity, or are they not in that business at the moment? Because that's awfully expensive.
Yeah. So that's a good question, Scotty. Mexico does not produce as much oil as it could. Pemex is heavily indebted and has been under invested for years. And in fact, I think what you're alluding to, the fact that there was such a demand for oil, were Mexico in a position to have produced more, they would have been able to fill a vacuum or a gap.
Yeah.
I think, for example, when the Biden administration reached out to the Venezuelans, and you can say that was a good idea or a bad idea, but it's a shame they couldn't go to Mexico and say, hey, could you pump another 100 million barrels?
Yeah, I would say it's a bad idea to reach out to Venezuela, but just from a geopolitical, but I understand why the U.S. did it, and that's
because there were only bad options.
That's right, only bad option.
And Mexico could have been a good option, and I don't know the precise figure, but I think if you looked at what the potential would be huge. There are challenges. I was talking to someone just the other day talking about the fact that because of the way Pemex is structured and because of the way it's been invested, Pemex isn't drilling out in the Gulf the way other companies are. I mean, there are real opportunities. Pemex actually is a net importer of gasoline because it doesn't have the capacity to refine. So it exports a lot of its oil to the U.S. and then buys gasoline back.
What a catch-22, because if you private, I'm biased towards industry, right? I run the Canadian American Business Council. I think the private industry in our world actually solves a lot of huge problems, whether it's in life sciences or any other innovation. So what a catch! So I'm biased. I guess I'm declaring my bias. But what a catch-22 for Mexico, because it seems like if you want to have an industry that has the ability to meet the demands of the world, you need an infusion of capital, because this is expensive. It is expensive to develop resources, whether it's critical minerals, whether it's traditional fossils, whether it's renewables. It's awfully expensive. And if the position of the government of Mexico is we don't want any outside investment, and we don't want to go into debt, I don't know how they propose to fix it.
I mean, they would say it's not that they don't want foreign investment. It's more a question of where that foreign investment goes, and again, wanting to defend the primacy of CFE and of Pemex, which creates all kinds of challenges for investors, including those who have global emission reduction commitments.
Which is everybody, pretty much.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is everybody. And if you're burning...
And for good reason, if I might say.
If you're using electricity that is based on generated with fossil fuels, then, you do a calculus. You either have to buy offsets somewhere else, or you've got to reduce your production in Mexico. Each unit you produce is dirtier, therefore you have to produce fewer to not exceed your cap. And I think that's a point that some, certainly in the Mexican government and the Mexican private sector, understand really well. Whether President Lopez Obrador understands it is less clear, which is why I said it could be that in 2 years with a new president, there may be a somewhat different approach. And
I want to bring us back a little bit to trade. When in the very end parts of the negotiation of what we now think of as the USMCA, TMEC in
they
Mexico.
Call it TMEC.
TMEC, and it's Canusa.
CUSMA
in Canada. All this crazy
Canusa.
names.
It's not Canusa.
It's
that's
not
us.
Canusa. No, that's not us.
Canusa, yeah.
Everyone loves
also,
Canusa.
We need to get whatever the Mexican twist on Canusa Street is.
I was thinking about that. I don't know.
Usamex?
I guess you could just do Canusamex.
Canusamex. There you go. All right.
Very nice. All right.
Anyway, last question.
Even geographic.
Last question or intervention, Chris, on trade. Go ahead.
So there was a period when we were negotiating what we thought was the new NAFTA, now USMCA, when I think a lot of Canadians worried that Trump might just do a bilateral with Mexico and leave them on the outside. Certainly some of the rhetoric we heard from Lighthizer and others made it look like maybe the U.S. and Mexico were going to do a deal.
Technically, there was a moment when it was a U.S.-Mexico deal.
Canada
it was a
wasn't
U.S.-Mexico
invited.
deal.
It was on
exactly.
autos, right? Yeah.
So there was that moment, and yet, in the end, we got an agreement. It is an agreement that includes all three countries. It advances some things beyond NAFTA. It makes some other changes. Last year, there's a little shameless self-promotion, Scotty. This is why you shouldn't let me ask colleagues things. But last year we wrote a piece where we talked about...
You and Andrew?
Andrew and I. We talked about the USMCA as a winning bet. And the argument was, as I recall it, that Canada and Mexico took a chance, got beat up for a year, and now they have an agreement, and Trade Promotion Authority is gone. And we heard Liz Truss coming to the United States as Britain's Prime Minister, explain to people a deal with a US-UK deal is years away because there is no Trade Promotion Authority, and so they're still having preliminary talks. Canada and Mexico...
We'll put that in the show notes, by the way, so your piece. Let's do that.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
So Canada and Mexico did a deal with the United States. They have a deal. There is a USMCA. Is it a winning bet? Did the Mexicans feel that that they got something good here? Are they glad they're still connected with Canada? And do you think North America comes out ahead because we have a deal and we didn't tear it all up?
Oh, I mean, without a doubt, we're ahead for not having torn up the deal. In fact, sometimes, Chris, I say that the best thing about USMCA is that there is one. That that NAFTA wasn't
somewhat of a low bar, but yes,
it was a low bar. But if you think about
right,
there was certainly a point in time. I mean, Scotty, I know you did as well. Was going to business community meetings, and there was really, really intense fear that NAFTA was going to be
he's crazy enough to do it,
and lots of stories about why he ultimately was talked out of doing it, et cetera. So Chris, I mean, I know that is a low bar, but I think that's the first most important thing. It was a reaffirmation of a commitment to North America, and this all, of course, happened before the pandemic. And, nearshoring was starting to happen, right? People were at least trying to diversify from China. But I think it creates a strong platform and that, people will take advantage of. I think, Mexico and Canada are similar in that the debate about whether trade is good or bad happened a long time ago.
Right.
And I don't think, sure, there are some people in Mexico, I'm sure, who would like it to go away, but I suspect those are people who are, sort of anti-capitalism. I don't think there's very many people in Mexico who think Mexico should pull out of USMCA and continue to be what AMLO would call a neoliberal economy. So yeah, I think it's, and my own view is industry, the private sector and civil society, we are all so integrated that even if the trade agreement went away, I don't believe the trade would go away. It would become more expensive and more complicated in some ways. But, would the auto industry or the agricultural industry really stop? To me, it seems impossible. So I think USMCA gives us the platform, the rules. You and I talk about this all the time, but, the consistency that is essential.
Well, I have an idea, Chris. Maybe after we're all in Mexico City in North American Leaders Forum, and Chris and I are gonna bank a lot of podcast episodes while we're there if we can, because there's some terrific guests
Absolutely.
down there. After that, and after the North American Leaders Summit, maybe we get back together here.
Yeah.
And let's
that'd
talk
be
about
fun.
where we are and what has occurred, and if it's somewhere between a nothing burger and a poutine taco and whatever
Such
the
an
other
awful image.
well, we'll come up with some festive holiday
There we go.
food to think about. But maybe we could do that. What do you think, Chris?
I think it would be great. We've seen things we never thought we would see happen, including Britain leaving the European Union in recent years. Almost 30 years after NAFTA, Canada and Mexico are still tied, even if they're tied to the fat kid in the middle of the canoe. They're still tied. And there's a point at which that becomes a fact on the ground, or does it? Do we walk away from this? And I think it's high time for Canadians and Mexicans to kind of develop their bilateral relationship a little bit more.
And I hope to be smarter on Mexico. I've spent a lot of time thinking about Canada and the United States, and I haven't spent enough time thinking about North America as a community. And this visit is going to help that. This conversation with you helps. And I'll say one other thing that helps, Andrew, is you had a session here at the Wilson Center that I had the great privilege to attend that was about a book that is out, and interviews with U.S. ambassadors to Mexico,
Right.
and it's called A Challenging Assignment, which I'm going to read on the plane on the way to Mexico City to try to get ready. So
Great. It's a great read.
really appreciate your leadership and your insights, and thanks for coming on Canusa Street.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
And now, what do we call it? What are we going to have to call it now? Canusa Mex?
Canusa Mex. Well, we have a little corner here at the Wilson Center with the Canada Institute and the Mexico Institute next to each other. So we're sort of a crossroads or North American corner as it is. So it may be Mexusa or Usamex Street and Canusa Street. They have a little juncture there.
We just have to end on one more terrible analogy, since this seems to be the podcast. But Pierre Elliott Trudeau used to talk about Canada and the United States, and he would say it's like a mouse being in bed with an elephant, right? And you feel every twitch of the beast. And one Mexican president said, well, at least you're on top. So the question is, here in the Wilson Center, is Chris on top? That's what inquiring minds want to know.
Oh, I don't
Okay,
know.
go
I can't touch that.
All right, thanks you guys.
Thank
Adios.
you very much. Adios.
À la prochaine.
Wow, Scotty, that was a great conversation. I'm so glad that my Wilson Center colleague, Andrew Rudman, was willing and able to spend a bit of time with us. Not only does he understand Newfoundland from his mom, but of course he understands Mexico very, very well. And as a longtime American government official, he has a really good sense of the U.S., a true North American all-star. And of course, This conversation sets us up for our trip to Mexico City and the North Capital Forum, where we'll be recording episodes to talk about how Mexico fits in the Canada-U.S. relationship and how Canada and the United States can learn from each other and from Mexico about the future of our neighborhood. Looking forward to bringing those Canusa Street on the Road episodes to all of our listeners. That's all for now, and Scotty, we'll see you next time on Canusa Street.
This podcast is brought to you by the Canadian American Business Council and the Wilson Center. If you like this episode, help others find our show and give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.